Before we return to that, though, I do want to take a look at what's happening in the Middle East. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned an operation targeting Hezbollah is not the end of the story. Forces carried out a wave of preemptive strikes in Lebanon yesterday morning, but Hezbollah still managed to fire 320 rockets into Israel. Given we're joined now by Daniel Levy, who's going to talk to us about this. And Daniel, given the existing tensions already in the Middle East, the latest of the Gaza ceasefire talks have ended without agreement. I wonder whether this decision to attempt to neutralise Hezbollah was a smart one.
What we've seen over months now is this constant calibration by the respective parties, which seems to be premised on the following. First of all, on the axis of resistance, Iran, Hezbollah side, there will not be quiet while the Israeli military operations in Gaza continue. So that especially applies to the cross-border situation between Israel and Hezbollah, but we've seen the involvement of the Houthis in Yemen, the involvement of paramilitary groups in Iraq, and of course the April direct exchange of missiles between Israel and Iran, which was a very unusual event. However, it has also been quite clear that there is not an interest on the part of that party for this to become a full-blown regional war where Hezbollah would throw everything at it. On the Israeli side, there is a desire to maintain freedom of operation and to reclaim some of the lost deterrence, and the shift in the balance of power has not gone well for Israel. Hezbollah has managed to do things that it has not done in the past, likewise with the direct Iranian strike. But for Netanyahu, while there is a political imperative to continue the war in Gaza, because that's how he holds his coalition together, that's how he's rebuilding himself politically as the indispensable wartime leader, there is not a desire for this to go so out of control that it becomes too risky for him. And in that scenario, there would likely be a much bigger US-led effort for a comprehensive ceasefire if we get into the regional war dynamic. And therefore, there's an attempt to calibrate on that side. And if you add to that, that there is not a unified position on the Israeli side. So you have the position of Netanyahu and many of the extremists who are with him in his coalition. And you have the position of the security establishment, who are not doves. They're, leading what we see happening in Gaza, which has led to International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court interventions because of the war crimes. But they are not enthusiastic about a regional escalation. They have leaned into getting a ceasefire in Gaza because that is the way to de-escalate regionally. And therefore you have this careful calibration. And partly you therefore see that even after this intense exchange and the expectation of this exchange for some weeks now, since the Israeli latest provocative extrajudicial assassinations, since that exchange, it seems that we're now back into the regular exchanges of fire rather than this ramping up to a regional war. But the last thing is, that is very, very hard to constantly calibrate. It's highly risky and lends itself to a dynamic that does see a much broader conflagration, even if it's not intended. And of course, you put the US into the mix. So on the one hand, the US is trying to threaten Iran and its axis by deploying more assets in the region, and that's what it's doing. But on the other hand, having those assets there means that Israel can take more risks, because if there is to be a war, the only scenario where Israel sees that as a benefit, and it's something that Netanyahu has wanted for some time is you pull America directly in. So the US is creating moral hazard here and a potential huge headache for itself, exacerbated by the fact that the US has failed to use its leverage to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza. Therefore, you can't get quiet in the region. It's a complicated picture, but that's the best way I can try and fill in those blanks.
I thought that was a fantastic and very comprehensive explanation. So thank you so much for it. I mean, we also know that part of the picture here is that 80,000 people in northern Israel have been displaced because of Hezbollah rockets and artillery being fired into the area. Do you think that those Israeli people will welcome what their government are doing, or do you think that they, like some of the families of the hostages who are still being held in Gaza, might actually turn on their government and say, we don't think that you are acting in our best interests and actually we want peace?
So these are really important factors to consider, which is you have these forces in Israel pulling in quite different directions. The immediate response from many of those who speak on behalf of those displaced communities in the north of Israel was to say, wait a minute, you only did this because Tel Aviv, and it seems that the Hezbollah was thinking of targeting a military structure, and Israel made it very clear it wasn't going to target civilians. I think that was part of their information campaign to say, unlike the Israelis who've been attacking civilians and who are threatening Lebanese civilians as they have done in the past, we're just targeting military. But park that for a moment. They are saying only when Tel Aviv was being threatened did you undertake this kind of mission. Why haven't you been doing it to protect our homes? So they seem to be leaning into more of an escalation, but there's no consensus there. You have most of those representing and from the hostage families who are saying, for heaven's sake, get the ceasefire deal done. You have, as I've suggested, divisions inside the Israeli elite and in the Israeli security establishment, and which is crucial to understanding what is the strategy here of the axis of resistance. As long as this goes on, and this is how you do asymmetric strategy, if you are facing a more powerful party militarily and economically, you feed into those internal tensions and you play to its vulnerabilities. So even if this doesn't escalate, what this is doing is creating huge uncertainty and anxiety in Israel for the economy, for the credit rating, for flights that are cancelled into Israel. And you're seeing all these things happen. And actually, the axis of resistance doesn't necessarily need to escalate and doesn't need to fall into the trap also of this situation where America could be brought in. And it sees Israel kind of scoring own goals and weakening itself. And one of those elements are these ever more intense internal divisions and struggles inside Israel. All the while, unfortunately, as we consider these geostrategic calculations, you, of course, have the continuation of those Israelis being held in Gaza, still being there, and tens of thousands of dead Palestinians, mass civilian casualty events of Palestinians as a result of Israeli actions. Every day, the humanitarian crisis deepens, spread of disease deepens, and the Palestinians in Gaza keep getting shunted from one unsafe place to another. So those horrors continue because that leverage is not being used. And the equation for Netanyahu is because despite all of this, he is still able to move forward without being brought down politically in Israel.
Daniel Levy, thank you so much for your time this evening, president of the US Middle East Project and a former peace negotiator. I don't know about you. I could listen to Daniel Levy talk on this subject all day, not only because he has a fantastic voice, but because he is so learned and balanced in the way that he speaks about it. He's definitely become my go-to voice on everything to do with Israel and Palestine. We will return in just a moment to our conversation about the winter fuel allowance. You're listening to Natasha Devon and the time is 5:45.